In 1860 United States, slavery was not hidden in shadows or practiced quietly on the margins of society. It stood at the center of the nation's economy, protected by law, justified by tradition, and defended as a necessary system for prosperity. By this time, slavery had evolved into a highly organized marketplace where human beings were openly bought, sold, insured, mortgaged, and inherited. The question of how much slaves cost was not considered immoral or controversial among slaveholders. It was a routine business inquiry, discussed in newspapers, auction houses, banks, and private correspondence with chilling normality. The year 1860 represented the absolute peak of slave prices in the United States. This was not because slavery was secure, but because it was under threat. The cotton economy was booming, driven by massive demand from British and European textile industries. Cotton plantations across the southern states depended almost entirely on enslaved labor, and every acre of land required human bodies to cultivate it. At the same time, abolitionist pressure from the northern states and growing political tension created fear among slaveholders. Instead of weakening the market, this fear intensified it. Slave owners rushed to invest while they still could, believing that if slavery survived, prices would continue to rise, and if it collapsed, they needed to extract as much value as possible before the end. In this environment, enslaved people were no longer viewed as individuals with lives and histories. They were converted into financial assets. A strong, healthy enslaved man between the ages of 18 and 25 was considered the most valuable commodity in the market. In many southern states, such individuals sold for $800 to $1,200 US, and in some cases even higher. These prices were extraordinary for the time, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today when adjusted for inflation. Plantation owners spoke of these purchases as long-term investments, calculating how many years of labor they could extract from a body before age, injury, or illness reduced its productivity. This pricing system was rooted in brutal logic. Enslaved people were expected to work from sunrise to sunset under harsh conditions. Cotton picking, in particular, demanded relentless physical endurance. A single enslaved laborer could be forced to pick hundreds of pounds of cotton per day, generating enormous profit over time. Owners calculated output against cost, treating exhaustion as inefficiency and injury as depreciation. If someone collapsed under the workload, the blame was placed not on the system, but on the individual body that failed to perform. Women were valued differently, but equally dehumanized. Enslaved women were priced based on their ability to perform labor and their capacity to reproduce. A young woman of childbearing age was often considered more valuable than an older male laborer because she represented both present and future profit. Every child she gave birth to would automatically become the property of the slave owner. This transformed forced reproduction into an economic strategy. Pregnancy was not seen as a human condition, but as a financial calculation. A woman's body became a production site, expected to generate laborers without wages or consent. Children were sold as well. Their prices were lower, but the logic behind selling them was especially cruel. Children represented future labor, decades of ownership, and complete psychological control. Many buyers believed that children raised entirely within slavery would be more obedient and easier to dominate. This belief fueled the systematic separation of families. Mothers were forced to watch their children sold away, knowing they would likely never see them again. For the market, this was not tragedy, it was efficiency. Slave auctions were public events. They took place in town squares, courtyards, warehouses, and specially designed auction houses. Enslaved people were forced to stand on platforms while buyers examined them closely. Teeth were inspected to estimate age. Muscles were touched to judge strength. Scars were scrutinized for signs of punishment or resistance. Buyers asked invasive questions, discussed bodies openly, and placed bids without shame. For the enslaved, these moments were deeply traumatic, stripping away all remaining dignity. For buyers, they were routine transactions. Newspapers played a critical role in sustaining the market. Advertisements described enslaved people in detail, listing age, gender, skills, temperament, and physical condition. Words like sound, healthy, and well-trained appeared frequently. These ads did not describe people as human beings, but as products. The language was deliberate. It allowed readers to engage with slavery emotionally detached from its violence. The suffering behind the words was invisible, Banks and financial institutions were deeply involved in the slave economy. Enslaved people were used as collateral for loans, insured against death, and listed as assets on balance sheets. Plantation owners borrowed money using human beings as security. If they defaulted, enslaved people were seized and sold to repay debts. This meant that many individuals were sold multiple times, each transaction uprooting them further from any sense of stability. A person's price could change repeatedly over a lifetime, depending on market conditions rather than human need. What made this system especially disturbing was how ordinary it appeared to those who benefited from it. Slaveholders did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as respectable businessmen, landowners, and contributors to national prosperity. Slavery was woven into everyday life. Churches defended it, courts enforced it, laws protected it. Children grew up learning that some people were property and others were owners. By 1860, this worldview had become deeply ingrained. Yet beneath this appearance of order lay constant fear. High prices meant high risk. Every enslaved person represented a significant investment. Escapes, resistance, illness, or rebellion threatened financial loss. This fear drove harsher punishments, stricter surveillance, and brutal discipline. Violence was not random. It was calculated, designed to protect value and deter resistance. The whip, the chain, and the threat of sale were tools of economic control. For the enslaved, living with a price meant living under permanent judgment. Every action could affect value. Strength had to be displayed. Weakness had to be hidden. Pain had to be endured silently. The body became both a prison and a battlefield. Survival required constant adaptation. Even so, resistance never disappeared. Acts of defiance, whether small or large, reminded the system that human beings could not be fully reduced to commodities. By 1860, the slave market had reached its highest point, but it was built on instability. Political tension, moral opposition, and human resistance were converging. The prices written in ledgers represented not confidence, but desperation. They were the final expression of a system trying to prove its permanence in the face of inevitable collapse. Understanding how much slaves cost in 1860 United States is not about numbers alone. It is about recognizing how an entire society agreed to measure human life in dollars, and how that agreement shaped everything from law to culture. This was not a hidden crime. It was a public system, sustained by profit and silence, and accepted as normal until it could no longer be defended. The pricing of enslaved people in 1860 United States did not exist in isolation. It was deeply tied to geography, regional economics, and the internal slave trade that reshaped the country long before the Civil War began. Slave prices varied dramatically depending on where a person was sold, not because their humanity changed, but because the system measured value through land productivity, crop demand, and proximity to power. This regional imbalance turned the nation itself into a network of human trafficking routes, operating legally and openly. In the Upper South, states such as Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky had been involved in slavery for generations. Over time, soil exhaustion reduced the profitability of traditional plantation crops. Instead of transitioning away from slavery, these regions adapted by turning enslaved people into their primary export. Human beings were bred, raised, and sold southward, not as families but as units of labor. Prices in the Upper South were generally lower, not because conditions were kinder, but because supply exceeded local demand. Enslaved people in these regions lived under the constant threat of being sold down south, a phrase that carried terror, because it often meant harsher labor, deeper isolation, and permanent separation from family. The Deep South told a different story. States like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina were experiencing a cotton boom that transformed the landscape. Cotton plantations expanded rapidly, fueled by global demand from Britain and Europe. This expansion required enormous amounts of labor, and enslaved people became essential to the region's economic survival. As a result, slave prices in the Deep South were significantly higher. A person purchased cheaply in Virginia could be resold in Louisiana for hundreds of dollars more. This price gap created a thriving internal slave trade, where traders specialized in buying enslaved people in one region and selling them in another for profit. New Orleans emerged as the most powerful slave market in the United States. It was not just a city, but a hub of human commerce. Thousands of enslaved people passed through its markets every year. Auction houses operated with precision, efficiency, and scale. Buyers arrived from across the South, armed with capital and specific demands. Prices here were among the highest in the nation, reflecting both demand and confidence in the plantation economy. For the enslaved, New Orleans symbolized finality. Being sold there often meant no return, no reunion, and no escape. Transportation itself became part of the pricing system. Enslaved people were marched in chains, packed into wagons, or transported by riverboats. These journeys were brutal, designed to move as many people as possible at the lowest cost. Traders calculated losses as acceptable risk. Deaths during transport were written off as business expenses. Survivors arrived weakened, traumatized, and disoriented, yet still evaluated for sale as if nothing had happened. Credit and speculation further inflated prices. Slave purchases were rarely simple cash transactions. Buyers often relied on loans, installment plans, and mortgages. Enslaved people were used as collateral, listed on financial documents alongside land and equipment. Banks accepted human beings as assets, reinforcing slavery's legitimacy within the financial system. A plantation owner's wealth was often measured not by cash, but by the market value of the people they own. When debts went unpaid, enslaved people were seized and auctioned, turning financial failure into human disaster. Political tension also shaped prices. By 1860, the nation was deeply divided over slavery. Abolitionist movements gained strength in the North, while Southern states responded by defending slavery more aggressively. This uncertainty created two opposing market reactions. Some buyers hesitated, fearing that war or abolition would destroy the value of enslaved labor. Others rushed to invest, convinced that slavery would expand westward and remain legal. This speculation caused sharp fluctuations in prices, turning human lives into volatile assets tied to political rumor and ideology. Resistance played a quiet but powerful role in this market. Enslaved people who attempted escape, organized resistance, or were rumored to be defiant were often labeled as troublesome, reducing their price. At the same time, these acts increased fear among owners, leading to harsher control measures and higher security costs. The market punished resistance economically, yet resistance never disappeared. Each act exposed the system's vulnerability, reminding traders and owners that human beings could not be fully controlled by contracts and chains. By 1860, the regional slave market had become a paradox. It was vast, profitable, and deeply entrenched, yet increasingly unstable. Prices reflected not only labor value but fear of loss, political collapse, and moral challenge. Geography determined worth, but it could not determine loyalty, obedience, or silence. The internal slave trade revealed the true scale of American slavery, showing that it was not a static institution, but a moving, shifting system built on forced migration and constant disruption. These regional differences in slave pricing expose a larger truth. Slavery was not just a Southern tradition or a local practice. It was a national system supported by markets, banks, laws, and infrastructure. The prices written beside human names in 1860 were shaped by an entire country that allowed geography and profit to decide the fate of millions. By 1860, the slave market in the United States had refined its cruelty into a science. Prices were no longer decided only by region or demand, but by the minute examination of the human body and mind. Enslaved people were assessed as if they were machines, expected to deliver maximum output with minimal cost. This process stripped away every trace of privacy and dignity. At auctions, inspections were routine and invasive. Buyers demanded that enslaved people open their mouths so teeth could be examined for age and health. Muscles were squeezed and flexed to test strength. Skin was scrutinized for scars which might suggest punishment, resistance, or an attempt to escape. Even posture and eye contact were interpreted as indicators of obedience or danger. Age played a decisive role in determining price. Children were seen as long-term investments. Though their prices were lower, buyers calculated that a child who survived illness and hardship could provide decades of unpaid labor. Teenagers, especially those in their mid to late teens, were in high demand. They were considered strong enough to work hard but young enough to be fully conditioned into submission. Adults between 18 and 30 were valued the highest, particularly men capable of enduring exhausting agricultural labor. After the age of 40, prices dropped sharply. Older enslaved people were often sold cheaply, forced into lighter labor, or abandoned when they were no longer considered profitable. Health was treated as a financial variable rather than a human condition. Any sign of illness could dramatically reduce a person's value. Chronic pain, injuries, or visible weakness were reasons for discount. Traders frequently hid medical issues to maintain high prices. Temporary treatments were used to mask symptoms just long enough to complete a sale. Buyers understood these deceptions but accepted them as part of business. If a person became sick after purchase, it was viewed as financial bad luck, not injustice. The cost was absorbed by the enslaved body, not the conscience of the buyer. Gender shaped pricing in especially brutal ways. Enslaved men were valued primarily for physical strength and endurance. Enslaved women were evaluated through a combination of labor ability and reproductive potential. A young woman of childbearing age was often priced higher than an older man, not because she was stronger, but because her body could produce more enslaved children. Fertility was treated as an economic advantage. Infertility or suspected infertility reduced a woman's price. Pregnancy complicated valuation. Some buyers paid less because labor would be delayed, while others paid more, calculating the future value of the unborn child. In every case, motherhood was forced, and consent was irrelevant. Sexual violence was not an accidental byproduct of slavery. It was woven directly into the pricing system. The knowledge that enslaved women could be exploited without legal consequence increased their perceived value to certain buyers. This reality was never written openly in ledgers, but it was understood. Children born from these abuses automatically became property, increasing wealth without additional purchase. The market silently rewarded exploitation. Skills and intelligence also influenced prices. Enslaved people who were carpenters, blacksmiths, drivers, cooks, seamstresses, or house servants often sold for significantly higher amounts. Literacy, though dangerous in the eyes of slaveholders, could raise value in specific roles. Ironically, the same intelligence and competence that made someone valuable also made them threatening. Skilled enslaved people were often subjected to stricter surveillance and harsher punishment to prevent rebellion. Their price reflected both usefulness and fear. Behavioral reputation followed enslaved people through the market. Those described as obedient, calm, or compliant sold more easily. Those labeled as rebellious, stubborn, or prone to escape were discounted. These labels were usually assigned by owners, shaped by punishment rather than truth. A person who resisted abuse could be branded difficult, lowering their price and increasing the likelihood of harsher treatment. Courage carried economic punishment. What made this system especially disturbing was how routine it became. Buyers discussed prices politely, negotiated terms calmly, and congratulated each other on good deals. Violence was procedural, not emotional. It was carried out through paperwork, inspections, and contracts. By converting human complexity into pricing factors, the market created emotional distance that allowed extraordinary cruelty to persist without constant outrage. By 1860, the slave pricing system had reached a level of sophistication that disguised its brutality beneath numbers and logic. Yet no amount of calculation could erase the truth that each price represented a life under coercion. The market could assign value, but it could not erase memory, pain, or resistance. Even as bodies were priced and sold, humanity endured in ways the system could never fully control. By 1860, the constant act of pricing human beings had begun to reshape not only the economy of the United States, but the psychology of everyone trapped within the system. For the enslaved, living with an assigned monetary value meant existing under permanent surveillance and judgment. Every movement, every sign of fatigue, every expression of emotion carried economic consequences. Strength had to be performed. Pain had to be hidden. Grief had to be swallowed. A moment of weakness could lower a price or invite punishment. Life became a careful balance between survival and invisibility. Families lived with the ever-present threat of separation. No relationship was secure because a person's price could change overnight. A plantation owner's debt, illness, or death could trigger an auction. Parents could be sold away from children. Husbands could be separated from wives without warning. These separations were not rare tragedies, they were routine outcomes of a system that prioritized profit over human bonds. The fear of sale became one of the most powerful tools of control, enforcing obedience without constant physical violence. For slave owners, pricing reinforced a dangerous sense of legitimacy. Assigning a dollar amount to a human being allowed them to frame ownership as rational business rather than cruelty. Losses were discussed in terms of depreciation, not death. Injuries were recorded as reduced value, not suffering. This language transformed violence into management. It allowed enslavers to see themselves as investors rather than perpetrators, shielding their consciences while maintaining control. Status among enslavers was closely tied to prices. Wealth was measured not only by land, but by the market value of enslaved people owned. A plantation filled with high-priced laborers became a symbol of power and success. High prices were a source of pride, proof that one had invested wisely. This social reinforcement encouraged further exploitation, turning cruelty into a marker of prestige. At the same time, high prices intensified fear. Every enslaved person represented a major financial investment. Escape, rebellion, illness, or death meant significant loss. This fear produced harsher discipline, stricter surveillance, and increased violence. Punishments were designed not only to control individuals, but to protect property. The system relied on terror to secure value. The enslaved understood this fear and exploited it when possible. Resistance took many forms, from work slowdowns and feigned illness to escape attempts and sabotage. These acts carried enormous risk, yet they revealed the limits of a system that claimed total control. Even priced, owned, and surveilled, enslaved people continued to resist in ways both visible and hidden. By 1860, the psychological tension within slavery had reached a breaking point. The market was profitable but brittle. It depended on silence, denial, and constant force. Prices could measure bodies, but they could not measure loyalty, endurance, or the human desire for freedom. The more tightly the system tried to control its human assets, the more clearly its fragility was exposed. The act of pricing human life had normalized cruelty, but it had also revealed the system's deepest weakness. A society that depends on reducing people to numbers must live in fear of the moment those numbers lose meaning. As 1860 came to an end, the slave market in the United States stood at its most profitable and its most fragile. Prices were higher than ever, yet confidence in the future of slavery was beginning to fracture. Political tension filled the country, and the threat of civil war was no longer distant. Plantation owners, traders, and investors sensed that the system they depended on might not survive unchanged. Still, the buying and selling continued, driven by habit, denial, and the desire to extract as much profit as possible before uncertainty turned into reality. In this final phase, slave prices became reflections of fear as much as demand. Some owners rushed to buy enslaved labor, convinced that slavery would endure and expand. Others attempted to convert human property into cash, selling people to settle debts or protect wealth. This created instability in the market. Prices fluctuated sharply depending on location, rumor, and political developments. The same individual could be valued differently within weeks, not because their labor potential changed, but because confidence in the system did. When the Civil War finally erupted, the illusion of permanence collapsed. Slave markets closed, auctions were disrupted, and the careful calculations that once governed prices lost their authority. Enslaved people seized opportunities created by chaos, fleeing plantations, resisting control, and seeking protection behind Union lines. The ledgers that had once reduced lives to numbers became useless records of a moral failure. Yet the end of pricing did not immediately bring justice. Emancipation ended legal ownership, but it did not erase the damage caused by decades of commodification. Formerly enslaved people emerged into freedom without land, resources, or compensation. The economic structures built on slavery remained largely intact, while those who'd endured bondage were expected to rebuild from nothing. The logic of exploitation survived even as the market itself disappeared. Looking back, the prices of 1860 reveal more than historical data. They expose a society willing to convert suffering into profit and call it progress. Slavery was not sustained by ignorance alone, but by deliberate choices made in courtrooms, banks, churches, and homes. The buying and selling of human beings was not hidden. It was visible, accepted, and defended. Understanding how much slaves cost in 1860 United States forces a confrontation with that reality. It reminds us that slavery was not a distant anomaly, but a system deeply embedded in modern history. The numbers written beside human names were real, but they were never the full story. Behind every price was a life shaped by violence, resilience, and an unbroken desire for freedom. The question of how much slaves cost in 1860 United States is ultimately not a question about money. It is a question about what kind of society could exist while assigning prices to human beings and calling it normal. The numbers themselves, whether written in auction records, bank ledgers, or newspaper advertisements, tell only part of the story. Behind every dollar amount was a life lived under constant threat, a body worked beyond exhaustion, a family living with the fear of separation, and a future that could be rewritten by a stranger's bid. The dark truth of slavery lies not only in its violence, but in how thoroughly that violence was organized, justified, and absorbed into everyday life. By 1860, slavery in the United States had reached its most advanced and most dangerous form. It was no longer a chaotic or informal practice. It was a system refined over generations, supported by law, religion, finance, and social tradition. Human beings were no longer simply owned. They were leveraged, insured, mortgaged, and traded across regions. Entire markets existed for the purpose of evaluating bodies, assigning values, and extracting profit from suffering. The fact that these markets operated openly is one of the most disturbing realities of American history. Slavery did not hide from the public. It relied on public acceptance. The high prices of enslaved people in 1860 reflected more than labor demand. They reflected fear of abolition, fear of resistance, fear of losing control. As the nation moved closer to civil war, slaveholders clung more tightly to the system that defined their power. Instead of questioning slavery, many doubled down on it, investing more heavily in human property as if higher prices could guarantee permanence. In reality, those prices marked the final desperate attempt to prove that slavery could endure. For the enslaved, price meant vulnerability. It meant that one's body was constantly evaluated, not for health or happiness, but for profit. It meant that families could be torn apart by financial decisions made far away. It meant that survival often depended on appearing strong while feeling broken, obedient while resisting internally. Yet even within this brutal system, enslaved people never fully surrendered their humanity. They formed families when allowed, preserved culture, resisted in visible and invisible ways, and carried memories that the market could never erase. The system could price bodies, but it could not fully control minds. The end of legal slave pricing did not erase the damage it caused. When slavery was abolished, millions were freed without compensation, while those who had profited from ownership often retained land, wealth, and influence. The economic foundations built on slavery did not disappear. They evolved. Inequality, shaped by generations of forced labor, became embedded in institutions long after the market itself closed. The legacy of slavery's pricing system can still be felt in disparities of wealth, access, and opportunity. Remembering how much slaves cost is not about reducing history to statistics. It is about confronting a past in which morality was overridden by profit and human dignity was negotiable. It is about understanding that slavery was not sustained by ignorance alone, but by choices made repeatedly by ordinary people who benefited from the system or accepted it as inevitable. Courts enforced contracts, banks approved loans, churches defended ownership, communities normalized cruelty. Slavery survived because it was convenient. This history challenges us because it forces uncomfortable questions. How easily can a society redefine humanity when profit is at stake? How quickly can language turn violence into routine? How often do systems persist, not because they are right, but because they are profitable? The slave markets of 1860 United States were not an anomaly of a distant past. They are a warning about what happens when economic logic is allowed to override moral responsibility. The dark truth of slavery is not only that humans were bought and sold, but that this buying and selling was rationalized, recorded, and defended as progress. Understanding this truth does not change the past, but it changes how we see the present. It reminds us that systems of exploitation rarely announce themselves as evil. They present themselves as tradition, necessity, or business as usual. When we look back at the prices written beside human names, we are not meant to memorize the numbers. We are meant to remember the lives they failed to measure. And once that understanding takes root, silence becomes impossible. That is why this history matters, not to shock, but to clarify. Not to accuse the past alone, but to recognize patterns that still exist. The end of slavery ended legal ownership, but the responsibility to remember, to question, and to resist dehumanization did not end with it, and it never should.